Okay, I think we'll just give it a minute more, maybe 30 seconds. All right, I think I'll start with the bio, and then we can jump into Thomas's presentation. So Thomas Cauvin is in charge of public history as the new citizen science of the past at Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History. Thomas is the recipient of the Attract Fellowship funded by the Fonds National de Recherche. He is Associate Professor of Public History at the University of Luxembourg. Cauvin earned his PhD at the European University Institute in Italy in 2012. And he was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan in 2013. He worked as Assistant Professor of History at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette from 2013 to 2017, and at Colorado State University from 2017 to 2020, in charge of the Public History and Museum Program. Cauvin has been president of the International Federation for Public History since 2018. He is the author of Public History, a Textbook of Practice. So today, Professor Cauvin's talk is entitled New Field, Old Practices, Promises and Challenges of Public History. We are looking forward to a very fascinating paper presentation. So without further ado, just before we go to the presentation, just some housekeeping. The chat is open for comments and questions during Professor's talk. But after that, we'll have the rest of the session, after about 15-20 minutes, we'll have open discussion. And also this session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the History Workshop YouTube channel. So I'm gonna pass over to the Prof.
Thank you, and thank you for the very kind words. Can you hear me well? Is everything working fine?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, I'm just gonna start by sharing my screen. Right. Can you just tell me if you can see my slides?
Yeah,
yes,
we can see them.
Clear.
Okay, lovely. So thank you very much. I'm very honored to be part of the history workshop because it has a long history, and it's a very important project, team, and endeavor. So the plan is for me not to repeat the article that I shared with you that was published a few weeks ago, but just to give some context on what I mean by public history and some of the maybe core discussions in public history. So as it was said, I've been part of the International Federation for Public History that was created about 10 years ago. And we've been busy connecting people who do public history all around the world. And there are many people who practice public history. And as you can see on that map, which is a map we've been building with the different courses, the different programs in public history, and you can see yours in South Africa, there are more and more public history courses, projects. You have even national associations of public history in the US, but also in Italy, in Brazil, in Spain, in Japan. So public history attracts attention and discussion. And you now have, and this is quite new, you have books, discussions in other languages, like not only English. You have this book in Polish, you have the book on the right, which is in Portuguese, it comes from Brazil, and Brazilians have been very much involved into discussions on public history. And in the middle, you have the Italian Association for Public History. So you have this international framework of discussions, people from Bogota, Colombia, talking to people from Japan, Australia about what their public history projects are. But since it's becoming more international, it's also more complex because different people have different understandings, different practices of public histories, plural. Here is just a word cloud of some of the issues I've been discussing with colleagues, with friends on politics, on activism, on definition, on international authority, and so on. So the article that I shared with you and that I can share again at the end of the discussion is about some of those discussions, right? I focus on some ethical issues in doing public history, and I want to highlight some of them in my 15-minute talk. First, and this is a basic question I always get, what's public history and how can it be defined? And I came up, this is coming from the article I published, I came up with the metaphor of a tree. So public is tree. It's a play word on history and history. And I conceive public history as a process, right? A process which is participatory, that is symbolized by the tree. So you have the roots that are basically the preservation and the construction of sources. That could be oral history, that could be preservation of a site, archives, and so on. So the roots of history. The trunk is what historians do and have been doing, interpreting the past. But as you can see on the trunk, you have different sites. So interpretation can also be plural and participatory. Then you have the branches, which are the multiple forms in which you can communicate history through books, obviously, but also through TV, comics, blog, tour, journal, podcasts, video games, and so on. And that's something I've been teaching in my public history courses, something that seems like a lot, communicating their research to a large public and non-academic public. And finally, you have the leaves that are the multiple uses of the past. That could be for tourism, for education, for social justice. And those uses are connected to the whole process, right? Some of those uses impact the tree, the roots, the interpretation. So that's how I define public history, with multiple roles for historians and for people who practice public history. And I'm sure we can go back to this approach in the discussion. Now, there are a couple of difficult discussions in public history. And one criticism that I got personally, but that others did too, is that we don't need public history because historians always have a public, right? And this is so a criticism that we have got, in the sense that you have many historians who already have, they publish in newspapers, you have historians on radio. So those people sometimes say, well, we don't need public history because we always have a public. And I slightly differ from that view in the sense that it's right, there is always a public, but this public is more or less plural, more or less diverse. And it's very different to write an article in a journal than to have a podcast or to have an exhibition. So I never oppose academic history to public history. What I do is I try to show the different levels of public engagement, right? And I think it's useful not to oppose academic history to public history because it's not about something public or non-public. But I also think that we need to train ourselves to be a good, well, let's say, call it public historian, because it's not because you're a good researcher that you're a good communicator. I used to be a school teacher. It's not because I was a good historian that I was a good teacher. I had to learn the job. And I think it's the same in public history, in which we need to train ourselves to become better public historian. Another quick, well, not quick, but important criticism is that some scholars think that public history is the same as memoirs, right? And that what we do is mainly supporting community memoirs. The criticism is that because we work with different partners, with communities, we tend to simply support or celebrate community history. So it's memories, it's not history. I disagree with that because public history is not like memory studies. We are not studying memories. And I also think that public history doesn't oppose to memory. It's not like history and memory. Memories inform history into exhibitions or into projects. So it's not a clear opposition. I think public history has way more complex relations between memories and history. And again, this is an argument that I developed in the article. Just to give you an example, and this was something I did like a few years ago when I was in the US. Well, I didn't do the exhibition, but I'm using this example. It's an exhibition, public history, that mixes memories, testimonies, and historical context. So they are not opposing memories and good history. They are doing a public history project with memories of people in Minnesota to commemorate the anniversary of the creation of the state. But, and I think this is the key discussion nowadays in public history. Public history aims to be participatory. But if you work with people, obviously you have multiple interpretations. And we have lots of questions about authority, expertise, who decides what the past has to be. And this is a very difficult discussion, very difficult topic, but something we need to deal with. I'm using a book written by Michael Frisch in 1990 about oral history, in which he says that oral history is by definition shared. In the sense that you have the narrator, you have the historian, and together they share authority to build and to make history. And some people have said that, yes, but if you share authority with narrators, with community members, then historians would lose their own authority. And that would lead to relativism, everything is equal. And again, I disagree, because it's not because we share authority that we lose authority. It's not either the historian or the community. What I'm more in favor of is to talk about combined authority, different levels of authority. You have people like witnesses who saw things. You have historians, you have curators, you have donors too. You have multiple expertise that play a role in the process. If you want to make an exhibition in a museum, if you're an historian, you're gonna have to work with people who have expertise, the designer, the education officer, the curator. So those are expertises and historians work with them. So that's how I see this combined expertise in public history. So you can have combined expertise with experts, so designers, curators, producers, or with publics, right? You have local historians, you have people who are called experienced because they have been through specific events in the past, or you have people who know about living traditions. For example, the native and indigenous populations who take part in the project. So this is an example of what I argue for combined expertises. But it means that not all expertises are on the same level. So this is something very important. It also means that not all interpretations are equally valid. We're not asking for, relativism, this equals that. It's still about history. There's still a process of doing history together with people. But I do think that public history practitioners could share the tools and the methodology to do history with people. This is something very important, not only sharing the final result, but sharing the process of doing history with people. And I'm gonna end with that question of who owns the past, which is another criticism that we got. Who decides? Who has the authority to define the past? And this is an example of, a controversy in the US when some veterans opposed an exhibition at the Smithsonian Museum that, challenges the use of the bomb during World War II, and the veterans opposed the exhibition that was canceled. So the question is, who decides and who owns the past? And this is my last slide. I think that ownership is a very challenging path for public history. I'm not using ownership. because it can lead to censorship. It can lead to states owning the past and deciding what the past should be about. Having said that, I think that public history has some core values, which are, for example, freedom of research, freedom of interpretation, and critically access the past. So when we do public history, when I do public history, I always try to sit with my partners to discuss about our core values, historical values or decision-making. Who's going to decide, right? Are we going to use consensus? Are we going to talk about different interpretations? And this is something that I think all public history projects should do, because sometimes shared authority or collaboration doesn't work. It's very important. Sometimes it doesn't work because partners have different objectives or different interpretations. Different interpretation is fine, but different objectives may be challenging. So once again, shared authority is a concept that we should develop, but sometimes it doesn't work because we don't have the same values. So I was told to stick to 15 minutes, and I think I'm pretty at 15 minutes there. And
you can go over for a couple more minutes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So this is, if you give me 2-3 more minutes, this is something that is also difficult in public history. When you work with different partners, different people, you have sometimes different interpretations of the past, right? Or multiple, sometimes competing interpretations of the past. And I'm not talking about myth and fake history, but I'm talking about different interpretation of the past. For example, the testimonies of the soldiers of the First World War on the home front, on the battlefield, were different from testimonies from people at home, right? So, but they had different interpretation of what the war was. This is an example of the centenary of the First World War in England. So how do you deal with different interpretations of the past? And I'm just mentioning a very nice, a very useful article from Sarah Lloyd and Julie Moore from the History Workshop Journal about connecting different histories. They call it sedimented histories, in the sense that you have multiple interpretations of a single event or of someone of the past, and you connect them through a process. So you have sedimented histories, they're not equal, but together they form a more complex understanding of the event. In that case, that was the First World War in Britain. And you have other examples, but I think this is a key discussion we should have. If we want to share the past, if we want to participate with partners, we're going to have multiple interpretations. So how do we decide? And who decides what's good interpretations, what's not valid interpretation, right? So we need framework of interpretation that allows the plurality of views and still stick to historical research and methodology to do critical history. So this is my final slide. Those are the key discussions that I've always tried to have with my students, with my colleague. What's the role of historians today? And who is historian too? Not only professional historians, but what about curators? What about those who practice history on the field? So I think we need to discuss how we make history also together, right, with digital public history, which is particularly exciting. So this, I think, should be, I mean, at least for me, would be the key questions in the next few years. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you for your attention. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Prof. And we didn't intend to rush you, but even in the short time you spoke, it was a very rich discussion. While we wait for questions, I'm just gonna attempt to just highlight some of the things I caught from your talk. So you focus on the sort of relatively new field of international public history, and how there's an emerging international network that you're working with, and some of the key things you spoke about in terms of talking about the field as a tree with branches, roots, branches, and leaves, and then you move to talking about criticisms of the field. Are all the one major criticism you started with was all historians have a public, so what's the point of public history? And I think to that you allude to the point that traditional historians are more in the ivory tower. So with this field, we're expanding that. And also you spoke about the criticism that public history is merely about memories, since we work so closely, public historians work so closely with the communities. And you explained how public history isn't the same as memory studies. And then you spoke about this key question that public history deals with, which is who owns the past, and that public historians should, shy away from ownership because it's a slippery slope to things like censorship. You spoke of the values, the core values of public history. Perhaps during the questions, you might recount some of that. And then you discussed Sarah Lloyd's and Julia Moore's article, which talks about sedimented history. I think you've linked it in the chat. And then I'm concluding it marks the way forward. So I already see Prof. Nespahoden with the hand. So I will take Prof. and then we'll in the chat.
Thanks, Kasonde, and thanks, Thomas. I've got several questions, but I think that I maybe focus it on one aspect of the issues that you've raised. But I first want to say, I think that was, amongst the several interesting issues that you've raised, the idea of the internationalization of public history is something that I'd like you to elaborate on for a number of reasons. In a sense, I think you're saying that even though public history has been around and recognized as a subfield for a few decades, in the last period, there has been a growing sense of international connectedness, that what one had before was a set of national experiences in which particular ideas and practices evolved. So, for example, in your paper, you refer particularly to the way the scholars in the United States or practitioners in the United States articulated the idea of public history. So perhaps I think it would be useful for us if you could give us some sense of how the kind of international connections have kind of opened a set of conversations that are kind of maybe founded on national experiences, and in the connectedness are opening new areas of conversation that may be useful, and I'm sure useful for advancing our understanding. The kind of second point, which is related to that, which I think is equally interesting, is that what you've done is to make the argument that the kind of practices of public history have also been important in kind of helping us think through, as public historians, what the different practices are, how our location in particular, jurisdictions create particular sets of practices and open areas of conversation. And the one issue that I would like you to comment on in relation to that is about the question of the state. And what public history or public historians' relation to the state should be, because states are not the same all over the place, right? So, for example, if I could bring it back to South Africa, in the 1980s, a founding member of the History Workshop, Luli Kalinikos, wrote some years ago that the reason why in the 1980s in South Africa, scholars didn't refer to public history, but to people's history, because public history in their minds meant some kind of connection to the state, to official society. And that was politically problematic. So if you could kind of, so if you could comment on that. And then if I have a second bite at the cherry, Kasonde, I'll ask my other 10 questions, but I'll just keep it to those at the moment. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Prof. I think, Prof. Cauvin, would you like to start with those and then we'll move to the chat, because I think that that's quite a lot to respond to.
Sure. Thank you for your comments. And I think it also connects to Sarah's question about public history and heritage studies. So I will try to combine them. Yes, the question of internationalization means that there are public histories, plural, right? And we've never tried at the IFPH International Federation to have one single definition, because it's not possible, it's not what we want, and the facts in the field tell us that we have public histories. So you have, actually, it relates to what historians and practitioners want history to be about, and what's the role for them of history. So you have different trends. You mentioned people's history, and that was very much, very important for Raphael Samuel, and people's history, or everyday life history. So that was a trend which was very much connecting with marginalized voices, right? So practitioner historians trying to support marginalized voices and to move away from this dominant official public narrative. So this has been something very strong in, well, let's call it public history, not only in the UK and South Africa, but also more and more in Latin America. In many Latin American countries, public history is seen as social justice because of doing the history of the victims of dictatorship, for example, who have been silenced by official regime. So in Chile, in Colombia, you have many public history projects that support this social justice, transitional justice aspect. So they may not use public history, although they accept and see what that means, but they would talk about social justice. And this is not something very much that happened very much in the United States in the 70s and 80s. Many people see that public history outside the US was much more radical than in the US, where in the US it was more about consulting, preservation, so way more radical. So you have, and again, I know you know that, and that's your question, you have public histories with different understanding of what that means. About heritage studies, and that's something that was very important in the UK until a few years ago. Public history was not very popular, but heritage studies was and is still very popular in the UK. My understanding, and those are very much connected, and critical heritage studies is very important for public history. I would tend to think that that the heritage studies is much more about the existing site and material culture, build materials, preservation, understanding, interpretation. Whereas I would sense that public history may have a broader scope, dealing with, for example, oral history, video games, tour. But again, that can connect to sites. So there are many connections between heritage studies and public history, but I would tend to think that public history aims at developing this public, whatever that means. And your second question was about public or people's history. Yes, there are very difficult relations between public history project and states. Sometimes it's state-sponsored, right? And you have state funding. Sometimes you have an opposition from the state or a control from the state. And I've written about different examples of state control of what's the official history. And in that sense, public history is very much challenging these official narratives, right? So you would call it people's history or counter-public history or whatever, but that would be in opposition to state, right? But you have other, other public-funded projects, like in the US, national parks are part of the public history field, and the national parks are sponsored by the state, which sometimes can be an issue when the president has very specific views about American history. So again, I agree with you that people's history have been chosen by some people to show that it's, challenging the official narrative.
Kasunde, are you there? I think that this is what we thought might happen. Kasunde's just lost internet connection. But then what I'll do is just ask the questions which are being asked to you in the chat, and then you can answer. So the first question comes here from Sarah May. She says, thank you very much for the talk. You distinguish between public history and memory studies. How do you see the relationship with heritage and heritage studies? That's the first question. I think there are three, so if possible, we can take all three in one go. The second comes from Luke, who's in quarantine in London. While we have a long history of thinking about the reasons to do public history and how to do the research here at the workshop, what is not always obvious to me is the more practical matter of deciding the best, most impactful way that public history can be practiced outside of the research process. Are exhibitions not too short-lived, for example? Are reading materials impactful? Is public education a form of public history? Those are the kinds of questions that he's asking. And then the third question comes from Gabby Mohale, who is at BITS. She says, thank you very much. Would you see a strong connection of public history to transitional justice projects and the role of archives in that connection? And are your partners in South America, for example, attending to that aspect? But yes, you answered that question, and she says that she'd like to connect with you about that. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I believe I answered Sarah's question about public history and heritage studies. There are bridges, and in some countries, they don't use heritage studies, they use public history, but it's also about interpretation and management of heritage. So they would see bridges. I only see public history as trying to work on that public, to develop the different publics and making history more participatory, but it doesn't mean that it opposes heritage studies. Luke, and first of all, sorry for your quarantine in the UK. I've heard about that, and I'm here, not with you, but I hear you and feel with you. Great question about what's impactful. And first, I should confess that we don't have enough information about what's impactful. That's why my project is trying over the next 5 years to see what are the different impacts of participation on the narratives, on the participants, and on the producers. So I may have more data in the next few years. But what I always try to explain my students when they do public history is that they need to choose, they have their research, they do some research, and they need to choose the format to deliver the content. And this choice is part of public history because your choice impacts your audience and your objective. So some of them want to do a podcast in a certain language to reach some people. Others want to, in the longer term, some people want to have a temporary exhibition and again, address some topics for some people. So the format you choose has a direct impact on not only the audience, but the content, right? So for example, if you write an article in a journal, or if you write a script for a blog, this is very different. And it's very important for students and public history practitioners to be able to switch from a script to something visual and to be aware of the impact on the audience and the accessibility of your project to different audiences. So choosing a format, there's not a single answer because it depends your need, your audience, your partner, and your funding, right? But it's something that we need as historians to be aware of and to be trained in. to access and to reach different audiences and to be able to work with different people who have different objectives. So I hope I answering your questions. And Gabriel, yes, transitional justice, the last issue of the journal, the International Public History Journal, was about public history and transitional justice. I can send you the link. It is very powerful. And for me, it's also powerful because that deals with activism, something I've been recently working on activist archives. This is a trend for archivists in the next 10 years to have activist archives. So archives supporting marginalized communities. You have, for examples, LGBTQ activist archives in Canada, or you have Native history activist archives. And they come from the statement that archives are like museum, not neutral. And they make us think about the power structure. Archives are usually connected to power, and traditional archives support traditional power. So there's this trend of rethinking the public in archives. So whom are we giving the floor to, and who is taking part in building the archives? So I can share with you the few references I have for activist archives. And this is a very powerful trend in public history and in archiving.
All right, yeah, I'm sorry about my internet hiccup earlier. And I think Gabby has her hand up, maybe a follow-up to her chat question.
Yes, thanks, Cauvin. Just to add to that, thanks, Thomas, for all of that. What was so interesting for me also, and I was busy taking screenshots until you said your article comes up, that you raised the issues of concepts first, because when I'm part of the structures of the University and the Research Archives at the International Council on Archives. And it's so interesting how we have different understandings of simple things for us, like civil society, absolutely not on the same page to colleagues in North America. And so these concepts are absolutely crucial to arrive on the same page. And yeah, thanks for the article on that. Would also interest me very much on activism. Thanks very much, Thomas.
Thank you, Gabriele. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. Civil society, but even public. When we discuss with some colleagues or partners from Japan, for example, they don't translate public because it doesn't translate in Japanese. And it's more than a translation. It's different meanings of public and publics. There have been discussion, again, it's not new, but about the public sphere and the fact that public sphere like hides the counter-publics, the fact that you need multiple narratives, that there are multiple narratives. So how do you deal with different publics in public history? So I agree very much with you that international public history is also about different understandings of publics, and history. So that again, that's why we're not even trying to bring a single voice, and there's the danger of single voice. So we're trying to connect people who have different understandings of publics and public history. Sometimes they can work together. Sometimes they disagree because they have different understanding of the role of history. And some people are not made to work together, and that is fine. But this discussion should be at the beginning of every single public history project. What is your objective? What's your definition of public? What's history for you? When you work with politicians or corporations, they have a very different understanding of what history is for, right? And this doesn't mean we cannot work with them, but the project should start with discussion, sharing discussion about what's history, what's public for you.
Okay, great. I think we have a question from Laura. I'll just ask if others could raise their hand as well if they want to go on the mic and ask a question. But for now, we'll hear from Laura.
Thanks very much. I wanted to ask a different kind of a question. a COVID question. Can you speak a little bit about what your experience and what you've seen other people doing in adapting their practices of public history under the conditions of COVID? At the history workshop, we've, like everyone, trying different things. In some ways, there are opportunities that are unexpected, like the seminar, for example. But there are lots of spaces that are shut down and really hard to engage to do real collaborative public history work. And we don't know how long this will carry on for. Can you tell us how different people are managing this?
Well, I'm not sure I can talk for too many people. What I could share with you is, first, we have noticed many projects that try to collect memories of the COVID, because people and publics, they see the historical aspect of COVID. It's a historical crisis, and people, media, they see it. So if they see it, they don't want to lose it. So if they want to lose it, they're going to collect it, they're going to preserve it. So there are hundreds, thousands of projects that collect testimonies, object, pictures, memories of the COVID. We have one in Luxembourg, but we also a map with, I think, we have 450 examples of projects all around the world. So people, historians, but not only, see the historical dimension of the COVID. One trend that I've seen too is the constant rise of digital public history because of, I'm in Italy, I'm French, talking with you in South Africa on public history. This is one of the beauty of digital public history. You have fatigue with Zoom, but that couldn't have happened like 20 years ago. So we have been seeing progress and new skills in doing digital public history, connecting people from different parts of the world. Just to give you an example, and some of you were part of that, a few months ago, we had a discussion about why and how to create a public history master program. And we had 47 people from 19 countries all around the world. And we are about to publish a document that was co-written by the 47 people. So that is an example that I think the COVID has straightened, because that's the only way we can work together. And maybe one last thing, because of the lockdown, we have kind of noticed more personal histories in history. All those projects of COVID-19 memory collect are based on personal histories, personal memories. And there's a discussion to have about the multiplication of personal memories of the COVID and very few national or even global perspectives. Obviously, the difference of experiences, where if you're Japan or South Africa or Colombia, but because of the lockdown, people stay at home, and you have these very local and personal perspectives that are just fine. But I think it's only one perspective of the COVID that we need to discuss for the future generation in the future archives.
All right, thank you so much, Prof, for that response. There is a question in the chat. I'm going to read it out from Njogu Morgan of the History Workshop. And it says, going back to the question of the internationalization of public history, can you say more about what seems to be promoting this trend? And are there perhaps emerging common areas of interest? And I think before you respond to that, maybe we allow Prof. Noor to also ask his other questions. Please, Prof, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kasonde. And I'm aware of the time, so I want to kind of squeeze in this question before we run out of time. It's the kind of core issue of definition. And as I read your position, Thomas, it's that we should allow the process that is unfolding to generate more discussion, open-ended conversation. Your metaphor of the tree or the umbrella metaphor, to try and include different approaches that may come from different parts of the discipline of history and perhaps outside. but also through practice. And I am in broad agreement with that approach. But I wonder, and this is, I'm sure you've encountered this question a million times, you know, is the danger not that public history becomes almost anything and therefore loses sharpness of definition? And therefore, your argument that it is a subfield of history then, you know, gets unsettled because it becomes too vague. So in this process that we need to have, isn't there also simultaneously the need to try and be more precise? Not that we can get agreement, but if we were, for example, to start off from Ralph Samuel's kind of notion of the participatory process as integral to public history, might that be, or could be something else, but might that not be, you know, one of the kind of core aspects that defines public history? And then from there, one might have different differences. Where would you strike the balance between those potentially conflicting processes? Thanks.
Thank you, Noor. And yes, this is a very good question. And this is actually one slide that I had in my presentation that I couldn't talk about. The comment that public history is, for everything is becoming public history because this and that, we are adding things. So I hear you, and I think it's a very valid comment. I would explain that by the fact that we have been trying to enrich our practice of doing history, and not only archives, writing an article, say, listen, you could do a podcast about your research, or you could do a crowdsource archives. So we have been trying to explain our colleagues, maybe they could do this and that. But you're right, enriching the practice, at the end, everything becomes public history. My answer would be that it's also history, and that this is something we should also need to discuss, not only the public, but the history, and that some things would not be part of public history. And there's a danger, and I think the international discussion on public history is very much connected to that danger that everything becomes public history because we are super enthusiastic and you should do this and that, but in the end, everything becomes public history. And that's a danger, because if it's everything, it's nothing. So I agree that we need core issues in doing public history. For me, first, it's history, right? So it's based on archives, interpretation, context, historiography. And I'm not saying that only professional historians can do that. Many of my colleagues in museums, for example, are doing this, but it's history. And then it's communication to audience beyond your peer. Then it's, for me, participation. At some point, you need participation with partners, with visitors, with other experts. And it's also, for me, applied to the present. And I understand that it's a very personal definition, and we can totally discuss those core issues, those 4 core issues. But if I agree with you, then we need those core issues to explain that not everything is public history. You have some core issues that are important. And if you don't do this based on sources, evidence, and interpretation, then it's maybe not public history. So in the end, yes, I agree with you. It's just difficult to identify those core issues in public history. Raphael Samuel participation could be one. For other people, it's only communication. Some historians do not want to share authority. They want to communicate history. And I don't want to tell them you're not doing public history. They're doing one aspect of public history. Yes, I think that was your question.
Okay, I don't know. I think you touched on Njogu's question in the chat. I don't know if you want to add any more comments, but due to time, I'll ask Sarah May to turn on their mic and ask their question.
Hi, thanks very much. Again, I really enjoyed the talk. Again, just sort of trying to get at that question about where does public history sit within other ways of engaging with the past. And it's really following on a bit from Noor's question. But my question is why are we centering academic disciplines in this discussion, right? Engagement with the past, interpretation, use of evidence is something that people do in all sorts of circumstances and have done for a very, very long time in most societies. And the disciplines of academic history, never mind the sort of public control of sites and monuments, are they're relatively new as practices. So I'm wondering why we want to center our academic, and we're sort of like, well, we're trying to stretch out into this other thing. In a way, the kinds of academic history that don't engage with other people, surely they're the small thing that needs defining, and the big thing that is the thing that all people do is the thing that this small thing can contribute to in particular ways.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, why are we centering this discussion on academic history? Yes and no. The point is not to center it on academic history. Academic history is one part of public history. And you have many examples beyond university of people, projects who do public history. So I think that the overall point is to put universities and research centers within a bigger circle of practitioners of public history. So I'm an academic historian in the sense that I work in a university, but my partners for my next projects are artists in the town where we live, because we want to do a historical fresco participatory. So with different groups of the population, we're going to have a 15 by 20 meter high fresco with an artist to depict historical representation. So I'm only one actor of this public history project. So, and I'm not even the main one, right? So I wouldn't say that academic history is the center of that public history, but you're very much right in the sense that it is power related. And it was very, very much the case in the US in the 1970s, when public history was controlled and developed by academic historians, because you had power relations and they wanted to develop programs, they had the funding, and many public historians outside university challenged and criticized academics. We've been doing that for years, and now you're telling us what to do just to get the credit and get new programs. So there are definitely power discussion in the fact that some academic historians and some universities want to build upon that market. And that connects to one of the questions, because public history is becoming a market with books, enrollment, students, and funding. So people have been discussing about that too. Is public history becoming, or has it been neoliberal because of this discussion on getting funding and the impact survey, the marketization of public history? So going back to your questions, yes, I think that's definitely something we need to discuss, and with non-academic colleagues too. I don't know how many non-academic colleagues are in attendance today, but that's something we've been trying to develop in the International Federation for Public History, talking with and working with people who are not academic. But it's also sometimes difficult because of the freedom of traveling and discussion that some academics have and that others do not. And I hope I answered.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'll just check. There are no questions in the chat. If anyone has any comments or
there is actually one. Sorry, there is one that I haven't answered.
Yeah, I think you want to go back to Njogu.
Yes, the question about. So I'm reading it. Going back to the question of the internationalization of public history, can you say more about what seems to be promoting this trend? And are there perhaps emerging common areas of interest? So I said that it's becoming even more popular on a global scale. Why is that? I think that one is first that these things have been existing and they still exist. People in Indonesia, for example, they didn't wait for us to tell them that public history does this and that. You had archivists, you had community history, and those people, well, sure, we've been doing this. If you call it public history, that's fine, but we've been doing this. But what I think public history brings is a framework of discussion that connects those projects with research and academic scholar, with media designer. I think public history helps connecting those people in discussing, whose history is that, what for. Archivists have been doing that. So we connect, I think through public history, we connect different partners that perhaps before we're not talking as much. There's also the reason that it's becoming popular because students like it. And I'm going back to training. Students like public history because it's project-based, because they see the impact, they see the product, the process of doing history and moving away from pure lecturing to something that they do. And I think students are a big reason why programs exist nowadays. And students might be the most supportive actors of public history. And finally, we need to discuss who and what history is in the public sphere, because you have more and more people who do production online, video or websites. And the question is, you have a multiplication of narratives online. And going back to the question of, is public history everything? No. So there is a need to discuss what's history and how to do history and with whom and these things like that, because the public sphere doesn't, belong to historians. So there is a need to discuss that. Public history didn't invent the discussion, but I think it can help in some extent.
Thank you for that. I think that your response to Njogu's question kind of wraps up a lot of, ties up a lot of loose ends and other questions. Prof, I don't know if you have any last comments. It's just about 2 p.m. In Johannesburg. So if you have any last comments that you'd like to make.
You're asking me, right?
Yes. Sorry, Prof. Cauvin. Yeah, there are lots of professors.
No, I can write down my email in the chat because I didn't have time to put the links. For example, the last issue of the journal on transitional justice, or if you're interested in the map or the IFPS resources in different languages. I mean, feel free, wherever you are, to contact me, and I'd be more than happy to share what we do and what we have.
Okay. So yeah, if the email is in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending. Thanks for the great questions. I personally learned a lot, which will inform my research and studies. Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Big thank you to History Workshop. It was super exciting to talk to you today.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thomas.
Thanks, Thomas. Bye.
Bye-bye.